When blacks were imported into colonial Mexico, there were four things they could pretty well plan on happening. They would be branded with a hot iron, baptized into Christianity, given a new and different name, and then enslaved. My name is Robert Siefken. Hello, and welcome to part 2 of my presentation called Blacks in Colonial Mexico, Branded, Baptized, Renamed, and Enslaved. Let's begin. The experiences of blacks throughout the colonial period in Mexico were many and widely varied. Many remained enslaved, others found ways to become free through legally and socially accepted means. Some became entrepreneurs in their own right. Others fought for the Spaniards as militiamen, and then there were some who rebelled and freed themselves from their circumstances. One such man who fit that last category was Gaspar Yanga. So important were the accomplishments of Gaspar Yanga that he's been acknowledged as one of the first liberators of the Americas and also a national hero of Mexico. Although in colonial Mexico over a period of time, black slaves did get the ability to gain their freedom by various and different means, there were those who chose to escape and flee their circumstances. Gaspar Yanga is by far one of the more well-known and admired of these. Reportedly, he was born into a royal family in Western Africa before being kidnapped, sold into slavery, and eventually sent to Mexico, where he was forced to work on sugar plantations not far from the Gulf Coast port city of Veracruz. There are historians who, with good reason, claim that blacks in Mexico were an invisible demographic. They existed there, of course, but they were treated as if they did not. Gaspar Yanga, however, was not only far more than just visible, he has a town in Mexico named after him now, and since 1976, the town of Yanga has held a festival of negritude commemorating the founding of their town and the brave man it was named after. Here's what happened. Around 1570 AD, Gaspar Yanga and a group of other slaves escaped from the sugar plantation they'd been sent to, and then they settled their own colony in an isolated, remote area about 90 miles away from Veracruz. So for more than the next 30 years, their colony survived and also engaged in raiding Spanish caravans going between Veracruz and Mexico City. In 1609, the Spanish crown decided to take military action against Gaspar Yanga and his fellow slaves. A number of battles ensued with losses on both sides. In the end, though, an agreement was negotiated between the two parties, resulting in Yanga and his compatriots being allowed to establish a self-ruled settlement, also designated with the status of a free town. The quid pro quo, however, was Yanga agreed to return any escaped slaves from that time on back to the Spaniards. Blacks, black slaves, mulattoes, and any other black-related ethnicities in colonial Mexico were treated differently depending on a number of circumstances, including the region where they were located and the period of time during the epoch of New Spain. Some were domestic servants, while others toiled in the fields. Some fled from their circumstances and either escaped permanently or were captured and brought back. Others were able, through legal administrative processes, to gain permanent freedom. Some, in fact, became managers who oversaw the labors of the indigenous, or they were able to join the Spanish militia, while a select few even became known as black conquistadores. No matter what your station in life, though, the mere fact that you were black or had black ancestry made you, in one way or another, lesser than those higher up the social ladder. As one historian put it, no matter how much you achieved as a black person, there was no wiping off the so-called African stain from your being. Thankfully, corporal punishment and killing of blacks was not widespread, but it did occur. The mistreatment and subsequent death of a black female slave in Mexico City in 1611, however, set off a chain of events that became known as the Slave Revolt of 1612. Here's what happened. A black female slave in Mexico City had been beaten by her master to the point where she died from her injuries. Word of this homicide quickly gained traction in and around the black community. Fraternal brotherhoods known as cofradías existed within colonial Mexico, with blacks having their own cofradías. By the way, I've included the word cofradías on this PowerPoint. The murdered black female slave was a member of a black cofradia, and fellow members of that fraternal organization were, understandably, very angry about what had been done to her. They demonstrated in front of the viceroy's palace, and they even tried to break into the home of the female slave's master. The viceroy retaliated by having the leader of the cofradia and the other black protesters arrested, beaten, and hauled off to prison. But at the same time, no surprise here, the slave killer, the master, had gone unpunished. So what now? This black cofradia got a hold of other black cofradias and started a plot to get revenge. Christmas Day of 1611 was chosen as the day to stage a revolt, and they even picked a king and a queen as part of their plot. Christmas came and went, and for different reasons, the revolt was delayed by the conspirators. It was decided instead that the revolt would take place during Holy Week in 1612. Supposedly, the idea was to start a general massacre of the Spanish population in Mexico City at that time. But an important downside of that delay is the plot was discovered and reported to the authorities. Spanish authorities took quick, decisive, and harsh action. Leaders of the cofradías were arrested. 114 Spanish spies were placed among the blacks to ferret out information about the plot. Blacks and mulattoes were now prohibited from being self-employed, from using gold, silver, pearls, or luxury items, and prohibited from gathering in groups numbering more than 3 persons. All cofradías were disbanded. A curfew between 8 p.m. and 5 a.m. was imposed on blacks and mulattoes. The jailed leaders of the plot were tortured to discover the location of the stores of munitions and weapons. Then they were sentenced to death and their property confiscated. On the morning of May 2nd, 1612, 35 blacks and mulattoes, 28 men and 7 women, were escorted by New Spain's authorities to the streets of Mexico City, where they were hung by the neck to die in full view of the public. 29 of these were decapitated, their heads left to rot on top of the 9 gallows. The other 6 were quartered, dismembered, and the parts were placed on pikes on the city's main streets and roads. The body parts were left on display until their stench became unbearable. 80 others implicated in the plot were exiled from the viceroyalty. Obviously, the persecution of those involved in the slave revolt of 1812 was draconian. Throughout the colonial era, other black revolts took place, but this revolt of 1812 is perhaps the most noteworthy. In the year 1810, in New Spain, Colonial Mexico, there were enough in the general population in Mexico who were fed up with being ruled by the Spanish that a war for independence began. This war would last 11 bloody and brutal years until Mexico gained its independence in late September of 1821. During the war, though, the abolition of slavery had been declared by the insurrectionists both in 1810 as well as 1813. By 1829, 8 years into Mexico's independence, in fact, a black man, this man, Vicente Guerrero, became installed as president of Mexico. In that same year, abolition became a fact in Mexico, although it's said it was even more formalized by the Mexican Congress in 1837. Unlike the situation with slavery here in the United States and our own American Civil War in the early 1860s, by 1829, slavery in Mexico had diminished greatly, and abolition did not cause a great upheaval. There were those who, not surprisingly, objected to abolition, and in fact, it was the abolition of slavery that was a major cause of the Texas Revolution. Remember the Alamo? At the same time, there were a number of runaway fugitive slaves from the United States that fled to Mexico and found safe harbor there. So that does it for my two-part presentation of Blacks in Colonial Mexico, branded, baptized, renamed, and enslaved. Thanks for watching. I hope this was informative, and as you might hear someone in Mexico tell you, adios y que tengan un buen día.